I'm David Berto. I'm the Director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I want to welcome you to our discussion this afternoon of the implications of the fiscal year 2012 defense budget. A couple of administrative details. One is that we have a lot of room, so if you've got somebody that you don't like to sit next to, you're welcome to move. I'm kind of like that flight attendant who says, you know, now you can move. The $10 extra leg room in the front here, see my assistant in the back to take care of that. I want to remind you administratively to turn off your noise devices, cell phones, etc. I actually found somebody the other day who still had a pager, so there's still some pagers out there. I don't know if there's anybody who sends anything to a pager. I actually used to have mine set to go off periodically so that I'd have an excuse to leave a boring meeting if I wanted to. Some of you may have done the same thing, so if I hear a pager go off, I'll know it's time for us to wrap it up. But if you would turn your devices off. Those of you who have joined us on the web, welcome as well. As you know, we don't have any real way of knowing that you're with us, so I would be most grateful if you would let us know that you're watching. You can do that by email, and you can send that to me, dberto@csis.org. That will also allow you to participate in the questions at the end, because I'll have my BlackBerry on silent, of course, up here, and would be able to get questions as the time comes. Joining me today are two of our other distinguished defense experts here at CSIS, Dr. Clark Murdoch and Dr. Marin Lead. I'm not a doctor, so I come in third out of that from a scholarly point of view. But we have spent much of the last 3 days trying to analyze the myriad detail that has come out. You know that one of the things about the defense budget is it gives you plenty of bulk. If you use paper or if you use data, there's plenty of material there. But one of the dynamics of that material is it generally tends to be either very high level, sort of summary level detail that's up at the top, or you're going through the C1 and looking at MILCON project by MILCON project. And so what we're going to try to do here is bridge a little bit and talk to you a little bit about what you should be paying attention to in between. We're also going to spend some time on the context because this is a very unusual time that we have here. With that, I'm going to welcome you. I'm going to sit at the table, and we'll proceed accordingly. And then in the end, we'll have our usual question and answer process. We'll go with the microphones. You'll identify yourself and your affiliation and ask us the questions. So thank you and welcome. So now, having introduced myself, I want to sit down and kind of put this in context, and then I'll turn to my colleagues here. We all know that the defense budget was put on the table on Monday. Roughly $553 billion is the top line level from the request. Much of the comparison of that number has been to different baselines. And one of the real questions you have in looking at defense is it up? Is it down? Is it flat? What exactly is going on here? The first baseline, of course, to compare to is the current spending baseline, and that is the FY10 enacted number. We're still spending FY10, obviously, because we're under a continuing resolution today. That number was about $528 billion. That's the spend rate at which DOD is theoretically running today. The continuing resolution, which is being debated in the House of Representatives now, has a slightly different number for DOD, a number that's subject to amendment. There are a lot of amendments being introduced. If you've had the pleasure of watching the House of Representatives going through its incredible maneuvering on this bill lately, it's quite an amazing opportunity. There was a virtually unlimited debate yesterday on an $18 million cut. This is $18 million out of $526 billion for boards and commissions. And if they're going to pick this apart at the $18 million each level, they're going to be at it for quite some time. It's enormously intriguing. I think right about the time we finish our discussion today, the section is coming up of the bill that will deal with the second engine for the Joint Strike Fighter, which is an amendment that's of considerably more importance both in terms of dollars and in terms of philosophical indications. But by and large, that's the second benchmark against which the defense budget is being compared. The third benchmark is actually the President's budget request from last year, which I would remind you, pull my number out here, was actually about $549 billion, only $4 billion less than the budget request for FY12. So if you look at last year's request, not enacted, not authorized, not appropriated, but requested, the current budget is up only a very small amount over last year's budget. In fact, in many ways, less than the level of inflation. So there's a lot of different benchmarks against which you can compare this, and I think that's useful to keep in mind. There's a chaotic process underway. I say chaotic because I can't predict where it's going, and that's almost kind of the definition of chaos with respect to the House of Representatives and what they're going to do for FY11. FY12 is not going to really be considered and debated until FY11 is settled, even though, you know, the committees are undergoing their hearings. Secretary Gates is still in the middle of talking to the House Armed Services Committee, even as we are sitting here today, being praised for everything from his green energy initiatives to closing the Joint Forces Command. And so that process is underway, even though there won't be any congressional action on it for quite some time. But there's at least 3 benchmarks between now and then that are worth noting as well. The first, of course, is the current continuing resolution under which all of the government is operating, DOD and every other agency, expires at midnight on March the 4th. That's 3 weeks from this Friday. Failing continuation of either a new continuing resolution or an Appropriations Act, the government will shut down at midnight on March the 4th. Now, those of you who come from a DOD background know that midnight arrives to some parts of DOD sooner than it does here. It actually starts in the Western Pacific very early on Friday morning. So that shutdown has very real consequences long before you get to midnight on March the 4th. But it's really the political dynamics that are difficult to discern, because either we're going to have an appropriations bill, and that sure doesn't look likely from our perspective, or we're going to have another continuing resolution, or we're going to have a shutdown. So that's kind of the first benchmark, if you will. The second benchmark is the debt ceiling. Now, we don't quite know when we're going to hit our debt ceiling. $14.3 trillion is the current ceiling. Secretary Geithner has indicated in communications with the Congress that we could reach that debt ceiling as early as about April the 5th or 6th, but more likely it'll be later in April or in May sometime. Voting to extend the debt ceiling is something Congress doesn't like to do very often, and yet they do have to do that, or else the country technically is in default, and that's a consequence that we have very little experience with, but are justifiably concerned about. Some indications are, however, that this time Congress is going to find it difficult to extend the debt ceiling by very much. Typically what you like to do is to have that vote get you beyond the next election, so you don't have to do it twice. To extend the debt ceiling with certainty beyond the 2012 presidential election would require a vote of somewhere on the order of $3 trillion. Right now, there aren't a lot of members who want to sign up to the idea of, I want to go home and campaign on having voted for a $3 trillion increase in the national debt. And so one of the elements under consideration is, well, let's just extend it by a more modest amount, $600 or $800 billion, right? That gets you to Halloween, and then you have to have another vote. And if you do another $600 to $800 billion, that gets you to next, you know, I don't know, St. Patrick's Day. And then you have to have another vote, and that gets you to Labor Day, and then you have to have another vote. And you can see a very interesting pattern here. The dynamics of that are not necessarily relevant to defense in the DOD budget unless defense is part of the deal that's cut in order to extend the debt ceiling. And the real impact there is probably not on the FY12 budget, but on the out years, because any real debt reduction bill is going to have to take a long-term view. And the long-term view for DOD is, let's say you take, I'll make up a number, $50 billion out over the FYDP for the first debt ceiling deal. And then when you come back at Halloween, you do it again, you take another $50 billion out. And you come back next spring, you take another $50 billion out. By the time you're finished, you've taken out $250 billion of defense out-year money. Now, we all know that out-year money in DOD is cheap, but when you add up enough of it, it actually has consequences. And the nature of the defense budgeting process and programming process is, it is a reasonably fiscally disciplined out-year structure, so that if you take that much money in the out years, it will start affecting the near years. There's no other option. And so the consequences on DOD of the debt ceiling agreements, none of which have been even negotiated yet, much less structured, is potentially quite significant. So that's the second benchmark against which we're going to watch. The third, and it's probably not a significant one, but it's in the minds of a lot of members of Congress, is the President does have a commitment to doing a review of our situation in Afghanistan in the middle of this summer, and to begin drawing down at that point. If you look at the FY12 budget submission, it indicates there isn't much of an expectation in DOD for a significant drawdown. The supplemental, the Overseas Contingency Operations account number that Secretary Gates announced of $117.8 billion is about 25% below what's projected for FY11, but that 25% is largely taken up with the withdrawal of forces from Iraq. It doesn't really indicate a significant reduction in either the number of forces or the op tempo of those forces for Afghanistan. There are a host of other minor issues that are embedded in here. I think we'll probably pick some of them up as we go along. We'll also save a lot of them for questions as we go through the process. So let me stop at this point and turn the microphone over to my colleagues.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I just want to make a few quick points. I want to reiterate David's one that it's hard to talk about 12 until 11's done. Clearly, there'll be some perturbations in 12, whatever the outcome of 11 is, and how much and how great, and the nature that they will take, obviously, is unknown at this point, but it complicates a discussion about 12. My fundamental concern about the 12 budget is that, in my estimation, it didn't really take on a lot of the tough issues facing the department, and that suggests that the harder choices are really in the coming years. I don't want to minimize the problem set that the department faces. As Dr. Hamry has pointed out, they don't have a lot of the levers available to them that were there in the early 90s. You can't pull out major forces from Europe. We don't have a lot left, although we may see a little bit of that. There was some possibility we might have in this budget, and we didn't. Can't consolidate the prime contractors much anymore. Hard to do another BRAC at this point or any time in the near future. Hard to take a procurement holiday from a holiday we're already on. And sort of significant end strength reductions or force structure reductions are also not feasible in the current environment of a couple of ongoing conflicts. So given those constraints, it's not particularly surprising that they didn't make any really dramatic changes in my mind. But I'm a little concerned about some of the things that they did not do and may have overpromised in some things that they did do. In my estimation, the biggest cost driver remains the cost of military personnel. Some very minor changes on the health care front that may be unpalatable to the Congress, even in their very limited form. But the fundamental cost drivers of military personnel haven't been addressed, and in fact, to some extent, the department doesn't even know what they are or understand them very well. But it is clear that if the current trend of costs of military personnel continues, that it will increasingly crowd out other things, and it has already done that to a certain extent, but that's a problem that's only going to get worse and is not going to get solved without some major changes in how we do military compensation writ large. Another sort of thing I had hoped to see but doesn't look like is in this budget. Despite the stated intention of getting rid of some of these specialty or boutique or task force organizations, we're still spending billions of dollars on functions that arguably should be the responsibility of existing parts of the department, and presumably some people in positions could be held accountable for doing some of those things rather than adding additional layers of bureaucracy and inefficiency. So I think the department could have gone further in that regard. And then in areas where they did do things, one of the areas that I have the biggest concern is the problem that they have yet to really deal with, I think, about how you cut military personnel, freeze or cut civilian personnel, and cut contractors and still say you have the same workload, which is essentially where they are. So that leads me to believe that some of the efficiencies we're counting on from all those reductions aren't likely to materialize. And the same, I think, is true for these broader unspecified efficiency wedges. We had a pretty high number of Lean Six Sigma black belts before all of this efficiency initiative started, so I don't think there's a lot of juice left to squeeze out of that turnip, but we have planned to do a little bit more, so again, I'm somewhat skeptical that that might actually materialize. Bottom line is I think FY12 is probably one of the easier years, and even if this FIDIP holds, we still have the looming problem of OCO to base, which they apparently tried to do a small amount of in the 12 budget, but a very small amount, and that's just an out-year problem that we're going to have to come to terms with. And who knows if this FIDIP will hold. History doesn't make that a very optimistic bet at this point. So I think going forward, the choices are going to get tougher. We're either going to have to scale back the strategy, we're going to have to make some significant force structure or end strength reductions. And so I think we'll see. I think it's going to get harder, not easier, in the out years.
The nice thing about going last is everything's been said, but that won't keep me from saying a few things anyway. You'll notice we're not really talking too much about the defense budget because we've known about the defense budget since January 6th. Details were there. We knew what Gates was going to accept, and I'm going to turn that to that in a minute, but it's really about the broader context for the debate over the deficit and what will be the impact upon the defense top line. For one thing, next year, and FY12 will be the first time since 9/11 that defense spending, both base and OCO, will go down. So that's the beginning of a trend. It's only about $15 billion down, but it's still down. When you look at the debate that's going on now between the House Republicans and the President over cuts in spending, there's a huge difference between the two of them. The House Republicans are calling for $61 billion in FY11 domestic discretionary spending implemented over 7.5 months. President Obama is asking for $6 billion in FY12. So right there's a very large gap between what the House agenda is, fueled by the Tea Party movement, and where the President is in terms of his budget submission. One of the reasons when you look at the open rule in the House of Representatives that's being followed, you don't see how they're going to get through that by the summer, much less before March during that time because of the depth of the struggle between them. But then when you start looking at what real deficit reduction consists of, is that this discrepancy or dispute between the Republicans and the Democratic administration is only about 12% of the total budget. Defense, non-defense discretionary spending, domestic. And in order to get at those kinds of issues, the Fiscal Commission said we need to take $500 billion out of both defense and non-defense over the next 10 years. And so for President Obama to say, well, I'm going to take $6 billion out of defense discretionary, non-defense discretionary, looks pretty paltry next to $500 billion during that time. But the New York Times applauded that because they don't want the Obama administration, and the President clearly agreed with that, to show any cards on the broader debate until the Republicans show some cards about what they're willing to cut. So entitlement spending is still that 600-pound gorilla that nobody is approaching yet. So then we start looking at defense top line, and David has already laid out where we are in terms of the different baselines that you compare it to. But what I think is significant is how much Gates was rolled since August of this year. Go back to what his red lines were when he first announced the defense initiatives, the efficiency initiatives. The first one, he's going to sustain top-line growth at 1% a year, and then use the savings to generate the additional 1 to 2% that was necessary to maintain essentially the program we have now into the future. Well, he got lost on that. $78 billion is being taken to the out years. He was going to produce $100 billion in savings initiatives. And the services were going to be able, the department's going to be able to reinvest that in force structure and modernization. Well, they did save 100, but $28 billion of that has to go to higher expected costs for O&M, for personnel. And so they're only getting to reinvest $70 billion rather than the $100 billion of services have been promised only last August. And the third thing is that force structure was off the table last August. But the only way he could square it was to start cutting force structure. 27,000 in the Army, 15 to 20,000 in the Marines. And so this is Secretary Gates, who I'd argue has by far the most political clout within the Beltway of a cabinet officer. That's a pretty rapid change in his bottom lines. You'd almost think he was negotiating with the North Koreans. Then, I'm sorry, that was too light. My own worst enemy for sure. Then he makes a statement on Valentine's Day where he says that the debate over the defense budget is increasingly distant from the real world, divorced from serious consideration of capabilities, risk, and the level of resources needed to protect this country's security and vital interests around the world. I would have thought he was talking about something like a $50 or $100 billion increase. He was talking about the difference between the two baselines. He was talking about 0.04% of the defense budget, which is the difference between what the FY10 real spending level is and what the FY11 request was. 0.04%. The president is saying, you know, if the Republicans go through those kind of threats, you know, vital military interests are going to be compromised during this time. That's still 0.04%. This isn't really serious talk about deficit spending. Only in America do we have relative decreases in the growth of defense spending being passed off as cuts. The baseline of FY10 baseline, still 2% growth during that time. This is just the beginning of a much more severe, and I would argue that maybe that defense budget train wreck that had been promised to us for the last 30 years might actually be upon us once again. Thank you.
Before we open the floor for questions, I want to give you a few additional data points. This is where you pick up your pen and get ready to. Clark mentioned that there were not a lot of surprises when the defense budget rolled out, because on January 6th, Secretary Gates did lay out essentially both the total number and his major, potentially controversial decisions in achieving that number. And none of that changed between January 6th and February 14th. There were a couple of items that actually we didn't know on January 6th that are worth noting. One is the announcement that the U.S. was going to end its involvement in the largest transatlantic cooperative development program, the MEADS or MEADS, depending on which cultural bias you have for pronunciation of the acronym. Air defense system involving the U.S., Germany, and Italy. And that was a bit of a surprise, at least in terms of the public announcement, without replacing it with another signature transatlantic defense cooperation program. We've had conversations here at CSIS about that before, and everybody knew that there were technical and budgetary and schedule challenges with MEADS, but there was always the feeling that, in fact, the transatlantic defense cooperation was significant enough that it was worth sustaining that, and it made sense to have a substitute, and there really is no substitute in place. And in fact, as far as I can tell, none on the horizon. The second data point, Maren mentioned the OCO to base, moving the supplemental back into the base budget. We all know that at some point in time, supplementals will go down from the 100 billion plus per year. And we all know that there are plenty of things funded in that supplemental that really should be in the base budget. But there's not a lot of headroom left in the base budget to put them in. It's our understanding it was slightly less than $5 billion. That is one of the reasons you have seen an increase in O&M over the FY10 baseline, is it's got mostly that additional OCO money in it. Although that increase, which is about 10% over the FY10, which is the CR level, is not that much different than the president's budget increase. So O&M always grows, of course. It's just rare that DOD actually recognizes it in the budget. So that's a second data point. Clark also raised the issue of the long-term debt and deficit. In 2007, so 3-4 years ago now, we had a signature event. For the first time since World War II, the annual federal budget deficit was larger than the defense budget. And keep in mind, defense budgets are at an all-time record high. So in 2007, for the first time since the middle of World War II, the annual deficit was higher than the defense budget. Now, those of us who are in the defense business know this means you could put forever to rest the idea that you could solve the deficit problem just by cutting defense. Because now you could cut defense to zero and you still got an annual deficit of $1 trillion, basically. The second thing that happened is if you look at the projections in the president's budget, and this is at the full federal budget level, of the annual payment of interest on the debt, somewhere around 2016, the annual payment of interest on the debt exceeds the defense budget. And this is, as far as I can tell, unprecedented. Never happened before. Now, there were times where the defense budget was so low that it may have happened, say, 1832, 33, something like that, but certainly not in any modern times. And if you carry that out a little bit, by 2019, the president's budget put on the table has an $800 billion deficit, and this is with his $1.1 trillion of reductions in spending over that time. 100% of that $800 billion deficit is the payment of interest on the debt. And it's $800 billion a year by 2019. So that's the magnitude of the kinds of issues we're facing. What you have with defense, though, and I appreciate Clark's having characterized what's changed in Secretary Gates' own characterization between August 9th, when he rolled out his efficiency initiatives, and today. He stated on August 9th, when he laid those efficiency initiatives out, that in his mind, defense was not part of the deficit solution problem. He said, we didn't cause the problem. The solution is in entitlements. It's not in defense. And therefore, and he was pressed on this point considerably by a number of folks who understand the arithmetic, if you will. And he said, I am not prepared to concede that point. Well, in the intervening months, whether he likes it or not, defense is clearly part of the deficit situation and is part of the deficit solution. And so the real challenge we have is how does that play out? Part of Gates' answer to that is the efficiency initiatives. One of the things that was missing from the budget is any additional information about the specifics of those efficiency initiatives. We got the big numbers, $100 billion, only 70 of it's going to go back into programs, the rest is paying for other deficits. But we don't know the specific details by year, by service, by activity of what constitutes those efficiency initiatives. We do know that historically, efficiency initiatives tend to be budget swags. You use them as an opportunity to take money out of the budget. Regardless of whether you actually ever achieve the initiative or not, you've saved the money because it's no longer in the budget. The question we can't answer is that the situation we're facing today? Only time will tell, and perhaps additional budget justification material. So that's kind of the situation we have, if you will, in terms of both the big picture. There are lots and lots of little details. You may have specific questions on some of them, and we may even have the answers to some of those questions. So you guys ready to throw the floor open? What we ask you to do is raise your hand if you have a question you'd like to ask. We'll recognize you. You wait for the microphone. Tell us on the mic who you are and your affiliation, and then ask your question, and we'll do our best to try to answer it. So let's start with the mic in the middle here.
Thank you. Sandra Irwin with National Defense Magazine. Question for any of the panel members. Secretary Gates has talked many times about $330 billion in savings from procurement cuts. He's thrown that number out many times in public speeches and testimony. where are those savings? Is that out-year phantom savings? I mean, do they really exist somewhere in the budget as far as trying to reduce overall spending?
Thank you, Sandra. The $330 billion in out-year savings from procurement cuts, I've actually, there is no document from DOD that tracks that, as you're well aware. What we've tried to do is to create our own calculation for those programs that have been terminated that had documents that showed the total cost to complete, that is, to run all the way to the end of the program. That adds up to probably somewhere between 180 and 240 billion of that 330 billion. Many of the terminations were not programs that were major defense acquisition programs, and so there was no selected acquisition report that showed the cost to complete projections. So we can't actually create a number that adds up to 330 billion from publicly available data. My assumption is it's the total projected cost of the program all the way through its end, much of which had not yet ever been budgeted for. So I don't think you can actually find that 330 billion in any budget and say they've reallocated that money. Much of that was beyond the out years, and if out year money in DOD is cheap, beyond out year money is really cheap. So do you have anything, you guys have anything to add to that? All right. Another question? This is great. Seeing no further questions, let me look on my computer here. I don't have any. Wait, nope, no further question. Up, got a couple here up front. Hang on, wait for the mic, please. And then go through the niceties of your name.
Hi, Vagan Marani from Defense News. How are you, everybody? Nice presentation. But when we talk about transatlantic cooperation, defense spending trends in Europe are kind of going off a cliff, which is why a lot of the European countries are looking at India as the best cooperative development model. 10 years from now, what does the cooperative development model look like if the United States isn't really looking to Europe anymore? Europe's looking more to India and China. What does that mean for a cooperative relationship, and does it then matter whether or not you have a $4 billion MEADS program or anything else?
I appreciate that question, both from a cooperative development point of view and I think from a larger global defense industry point of view. We've taken a good look at European defense spending over the last decade, and you're absolutely right, Vago. It's going down, and it's projected to go down even further. The average annual decline in European defense spending over the last decade is almost 2% per year, and that's in the aggregate across all the countries. And what's even more dramatic is they've actually cut their number of troops by an even faster amount, close to 4% per year. So in an odd way, the spending per soldier is actually up, but the number of soldiers is down. There's obviously a limit to how long you can continue that progress, although Europe has more than 1 million men in arms more than the U.S. does, so there's still a wide way for them to go. The real question, though, I think, is not the total defense spending. It's the defense spending on the investment accounts, on procurement, on research and development. And intriguingly, that's been one of the areas in European defense spending that has declined the least. It's been almost flat over that same decade. So there's still a substantial amount of investment from Europe in procurement, in production of weapon systems and components, and in the research and development associated with that. This is largely unrecognized by the U.S., and I think it's a policy gap in terms of the way in which we're thinking about Europe. And I think that the Meads decision actually reflects in many ways the absence of a clear U.S. policy that says we understand where Europe's going. It's in our interest to help them preserve the technological capability more than it is the actual numbers, and therefore we're going to take actions to do that. I think it's a policy gap, and there's nothing in this defense budget that addresses that gap. Anybody want to add something to that?
Yeah, I look at it from a, I don't want to say a broader context, but certainly a different context, and that is a mismatch between capabilities and strategy. Because while there is a lot of spending in Europe, I'm not sure how much real capability there is in Europe. I have seen studies that have indicated that the U.S. Marine Corps by itself is probably more capable of deploying forces in the middle of Australia than all of NATO Europe during that time. So yes, there's dollars being spent and people being recruited, but how much real capability there is there? And one of the dominant themes, not just in the recent QDR, but two QDRs, I think it started in 2005, 2006 QDR, but in national security strategies ever since, is the notion of building partnership capacity, capability, that the United States military can't do it on its own, so we have to have more capability, operational capabilities in non-defense agencies among the U.S. government, and we have to do more multinational cooperation. Except that I tend to be a skeptic of, you have to have operational cultures to have operational capabilities. We don't have a lot of operational capabilities in non-defense agencies. And these are decades-long changes. Even if you had the will and the dollars to do it, you do not train State Department officials to develop, to provide operational capabilities in less than a decade. And when you have the decline in real capabilities among almost all nations, China obviously is an exception, India perhaps is an exception, what I see is strategies, national security strategies, objectives that are fairly maximalist when you look at them in terms of their ends being pursued by inadequate means. So that's a different kind of crisis.
I just want to add one quick point about a different angle of the gap that you raised, Vago, which is I think we still don't have a good strategy for figuring out how to do cooperative arrangements, particularly given our growing focus on supply chain control and verifiability and the like. As if in fact there is this shift in locus, we are behind the 8 ball in trying to figure out how to do that in a productive way that meets our security needs. So that's another aspect of the problem that you raise.
I have a question in from the web, and then I have at least one more here in the audience. The question from the web is, do you know what else is driving the large increase in the operation and maintenance budget between FY11 and FY12? I mentioned, of course, the nearly $5 billion from the supplemental that had migrated into the O&M base. Let me just give you the numbers. You don't have to write these down. There won't be a test at the end. O&M in the FY10 appropriations, so that's the baseline of what we're spending on today from the continuing resolution, is about $183 billion for the O&M account, operation and maintenance account. The proposed amount for FY12 is $204 billion, so that's an increase of about $20 billion. However, last year's proposed had $200 billion in O&M. Typically what happens in DOD is when the fiscal year arrives, you start spending what you had put in the budget regardless of what Congress has necessarily given you, because that was your plan and you haven't stopped doing things. My suspicion is that the spend rate in FY11 on a month-by-month basis probably exceeds the CR level. So there's a limit to how much you can cut back. $5 billion of that $20 billion increase is from the supplementals. The other $15 billion is probably must-pay bills, civilian personnel, invoices for services outside the supplementals. So I think it's entirely predictable, and on a flat line basis, it's only about 4 or 5% per year. And if you take the supplemental out, it's only about 2.5 or 3% per year. So it's not an unreasonable growth in O&M given what's going on.
I just want to second that by saying the O&M inflation rates have typically been much larger than in other accounts, and so I think they have made an effort to try to more realistically reflect some of that O&M cost growth last year, and may have fallen off a bit this year, but again, the inflation rates have in many cases exceeded 10%. So, and a lot of effort inside the department, again, trying to understand the drivers of that cost growth, and not a lot of progress, to the best of my knowledge, in getting a better handle on what they can actually do to try to arrest it.
And most of you know that one of the fastest growing accounts in the defense budget is the health care budget. The health program is buried in that O&M account. It's over $30 billion for FY12, and that probably accounts for another significant percentage of the growth. We've got another question here in front, and then one in the middle here.
Can you hear? I'm Harlan Ullman. Thanks for a very professional and well done presentation. I have 2 questions. In the 80s, as you remember, CSIS did a number of studies that predicted a similar problem in defense. And fortunately, the Soviet Union imploded, and that took care of things because we were able to reduce. In those days, we were somewhere between a quarter to a third underfunded or over. What is your best guess? And it's a guess because you're not going to know how much cuts are going to be coming, but what do you think over the next couple of years the big deficit's going to be in terms of how much we're really going to have to cut back defense? And secondly, and most importantly, what are your views for having strategy to lead this, and what sort of alternative strategies would you call for if, for example, we have a third or a quarter too much or we've got to cut back by that?
I tend to be unduly pessimistic. It's partially my nature. When I was an analyst at the CIA, I could always identify the forces that I thought had a compelling logic, but always underestimated how long it would take. Things that I thought would take 3 to 5 years took 10 to 15. I think the same thing is true in the Defense Department. And that is that when you look at the numbers, you say, well, we're going to have to come down by a third in 3 years to have a chance of making this right. Doesn't happen that way. We come down to 6 over 10 years. And essentially what happens is the force gets hollowed out from within. And so if you were to look at nominal dollars, I think the decline is going to be relatively small. But if you look at real capabilities, I think there's going to be a lot of hollowed out capabilities there. Now, under those kind of conditions, you say to yourself, well, how do we get out of this? Well, we have a strategy. You have to prioritize between what's important, what's more peripheral. We have to prioritize between things that we really, really have to protect core interests and things that maybe we don't want to do. Well, those aren't the kind of decisions that our political system is very good at. And so my feeling is that you'll see, as we did after Vietnam, and after we've gone through similar periods like that, a gradual fragility and hollowing out from within, from things like personnel costs, health costs, rising costs of O&M, we fly less. And then we'll see a pulling back in terms of the kinds of actions that we take abroad because we know we don't have real capability.
I largely share Clark's views, and I'm not, I'd rather speak to the strategies question just because I think the projections on the out years is too hard, and I don't have a clue. But from the strategy perspective, I think clearly we have, in my mind, been worse than usual, or certainly on a trend in the wrong direction in terms of clarity to our strategy. We've broadened the defense remit over the past 10 years pretty dramatically. It's now essentially everything. I don't know what doesn't fall into one of the 4 bins of the QDR. I'm hard pressed to think of anything that I couldn't put under one of those. So setting priorities under those conditions becomes a non-issue or a non-event, and it hasn't happened in my estimation in any significant way. And together with that, I think we've lost. We don't even pretend to have a force sizing construct anymore. So I would hope, and I don't know how realistic this hope is, but I would hope that we would get back to some real force sizing construct, which I think has to is a guard against some of the hollowing out that Clark talked about, and is a forcing function to try to get more clarity on priority setting. And then I think, while I'm not optimistic about a public strategy, and I'm not sure you need one that's clearly articulated, I think you're going to have a strategy that decreases the emphasis in certain regions. And I suspect we'll see engagements that look more like the Biden counterterrorism strategy than any large engagements in any place in particular. And one of my concerns is that we will become increasingly sort of seduced by the building partner capacity argument, which in theory, reduces the probability of major conflicts, and that we will sort of tie our budget cuts to the success of that strategy. And while it may be a good strategy, I don't think we've really examined it in any clear, compelling, or objective way. So I hope that before we would head down that path, we would be a little bit more deliberate about looking back to see whether there's any historical evidence that that might be a smart strategy to pursue. That's not a very satisfying answer, but that's some of my thoughts.
Harlan, I'm an optimist rather than a pessimist. I think it's going to get way worse than we thought it was going to get. You're absolutely right to hark us back to the end of the Cold War. Back in the mid-1960s, Bob McNamara's budget director, Alan Enthoven, said the worst thing you can do to the services is take away their shortfalls, because then they don't know how to manage. Well, for one brief shining moment in 1989, our shortfalls disappeared. We actually had more than we needed and didn't know what to do with it. We quickly took care of that problem, and we recreated shortfalls. A combination of rapid cuts and cost growth took care of it easily. I don't think we're now facing a situation where we're going to eliminate the shortfalls. And in fact, I think there are four key questions or three aspects of the questions of how much more are we going to come down and when are we going to come down. One is that left to its own, the votes aren't there to cut force structure until we start drawing down in Afghanistan. When you've got 98,000 troops deployed overseas in combat, it's really difficult to muster the votes to do dramatic cuts in defense. That's probably going to be 2014. That's what we seem to have agreed on. Of course, things could go swimmingly well and we could come home early, but I'm not that much of an optimist. But that was, that was before the November 2nd election. When Secretary Gates had us in to talk about the efficiency initiatives Australia announced in last August, he said in essence, and I don't remember the exact quote, and it was on the record but not recorded for the record, he said in essence, my real fear with respect to the Congress is that enough deficit hawks will get elected and they'll combine with the left that doesn't actually like to vote for defense spending, and the two of them together will create a reckless environment for dramatic cuts in DOD, regardless of the consequences. I don't know if we're there. I kind of don't think we are, but it's a little early to tell. You know, the whip counts for House votes today is remarkably inaccurate, and there's a wide range of possible outcomes. Just witness what happened under suspension of the rules with the expiring provisions of the Patriot Act, where enough Republicans voted against it that the bill had to be pulled back and voted on again a week later. So I think there's still some uncertainty in terms of whether the votes are there. So historically, we wouldn't cut defense dramatically with the troops still deployed, but that might not be the case. That's the first thing to watch. The second is, post-2014, everything's open and up for grabs. And ultimately, you know, the only way you can really cut defense is to cut force structure. And if you look at where the force structure cuts are likely to come from, it's the land forces. I would recommend you back to the QDR, which basically said we want to win the wars we're in now, and that's kind of the land forces approach to the QDR. And for the air and sea, you're assigned to go off and think about the air-sea battle concept for the future, which is a study without a terms of reference. It's wending its way forward. My view is sort of it's two studies united by a common introduction. You know, Air Force is doing its side, Navy's doing its side, and I'm not quite sure what the impact of it is from a programmatic point of view, but from a thinking point of view, it's pretty dramatic. It says that 2025 and beyond is really not a land forces game that we're going to play. And Marin's point about we don't have a force planning construct is fundamentally the case. Left to its own devices, land forces is where you take the money out. Now that's really interesting because the third aspect is where are the shortfalls today? And by far the most dramatic shortfalls, undocumented, not yet recognized, are in the Army. And they're both a shortfall in terms of paying for the force structure that you've got over the long run, because it's only a temporary force structure increase, but even more so it's a shortfall in the modernization and equipment. The Army doesn't have clear programs for ground combat vehicles, doesn't have clear programs for what they call tactical wheeled vehicles, which to me is trucks. But it's obviously more sophisticated than these trucks because they're going to cost $1 million a piece if left to their own devices. And these are not programmed and in the budget. When you have to replace 160,000 trucks and they cost $1 million a piece, that's more money than the Army's going to have. Those are the kinds of shortfalls that aren't being recognized and dealt with. So if you put all three of those together and add on top of that the $800 billion a year deficit problem, you've really got the potential for a nightmare. But I would submit to you that absent a change in the votes, we don't get there for a couple of years. We got a couple of years to work pretty hard on building a game plan to be ready for it. There's a question in the back, and then I have one question on the, from the web here.
Thank you. Anders Romerheim from the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. The United States does not only pay to equip itself with the military. Direct military aid and equipment abroad is not the biggest part of the spending, but it certainly seems like we're in a time where every avenue has to be explored as to where you can cut. How do you see the potential for or the future of such direct military aid, especially to the Eurasian theater? And what do you think could be a viable approach to forging those kind of partnerships, apart from just giving away a lot of military equipment at astronomical prices? Thank you.
I would say that for me, there are parts of the budget in terms of military assistance in the State Department that I haven't looked at yet. I actually have the printed tables, but I haven't yet consulted them. So I don't really know what's in the President's budget submission in that regard. I know a couple things that are not likely to get appropriated because they haven't yet taken account of recent events in certain countries in North Africa and the Middle East. But overall, I think that it's not clear to me that there's a fundamental change in strategy that reflects the changing nature of the world in which we face, and I think that still remains to be played out. I don't know if the rest of you have looked at that at all.
I haven't looked at it, but I just want to make the point that I think there is also this, well, I certainly think it's an area that is ripe, always a popular target for scrutiny, in the absence of an industrial-based strategy, which I would argue we have right now. We have the absence of it. That may become more explicit. I mean, I think that's the other sort of countervailing tension against the scrutiny that those kinds of accounts will face, and I think legitimately that may prevail, even if people don't accept or don't like the foreign support. That may be the best industrial-based strategy we have.
The next question from the web is very interesting. It says, defense company stock prices have rallied since the end of 2010. Are investors being too sanguine about the outlook for the industry? I love the word sanguine there because, of course, it has multiple meanings. And I can take it in either direction. We can be pessimistic or optimistic about the sanguinity of this. But it really raises a very, very profound and important question, and that is the relationship between what the investment community thinks is going to happen and what the rest of us think is going to happen based on the documentation that we're arguing here. Defense stocks, and we track this fairly carefully here, have essentially been valued at a level for quite some time now that projected that defense spending would go down. The market has already taken this into account, took it into account quite some time ago. The rally that occurred so far since the end of 2010 would have had its most dramatic right after Bob Gates made his announcements on January 6th, where he basically said, I'm taking cuts, but the cuts aren't big, and I'm protecting procurement and R&D as part of that process. And the budget that was put on the table this week still reflects that. Procurement accounts are protected. R&D is protected. The biggest changes in R&D are migrations from R&D into procurement. And actually the science and technology budget, the basic research, is up by a real growth of a little bit over 2%. So there's a good bit of protection of your basic investment accounts. I think the longer-term question from the market's perspective is what happens beyond the next 3 months. You know, my understanding is that they've sort of built in an assumption over the long haul of something on the order of a 20 to 30% reduction in DOD, and that's built into the stock price already. So a modest gain since the end of 2010 is really only a blip in the long-term already self-corrected process. But I think the larger fear that Wall Street has is the March 4th government shutdown, and what are the odds of a real shutdown now? You know, the conversations that I have with analysts leads me to conclude that they put somewhere on the order of a 20 to 30% probability of a government shutdown. We don't do bets like the Brits do. All our bets are actually through the stock market, so they're not really gambling. I don't bet my own money through the stock market because that would be gambling. But in reality, I think the assumption that the government's not going to be able to get its way through, that they are going to have a shutdown, is probably of graver concern right now than defense stock performance in general. Overall, the stock is based on a couple of important factors. One is that margins are pretty low for defense companies compared to their non-defense counterparts. But from a cash flow return on investment point of view, it tends to be up because the government's a good customer, it pays its bills, and the long-term programs are pretty reliable. So there's kind of a balance there between lower margins and higher cash flow return on investment. That balance is subject, obviously, to disruption, but there's nothing imminent in the budget that we have laid out here today that projects that disruption. So I think that probably draws us to the end. We got any more? We got a couple more questions out here. Let's go to the middle and then the right.
Hi, Steve Flanagan from CSIS. I wanted to draw you out a little bit more on the comment you were just alluding to. David started and picked up on something Maren said about that we're preparing the Army to be optimized, through 2014 to win the wars it's currently engaged in. So heavy emphasis on irregular warfare, counterinsurgency, a world of perpetual conflict, smaller ones. But what if we do get to 2014 and suddenly, as you said, if the Army, Air Force, and the Navy are being optimized to deal with these greater than expected contingencies or major, conflicts in some other theater, is the Army? What can the Army do to pivot at some point? What if it ends up that we're more worried about some kind of major land war, a Korean Peninsula contingency, or a major land war in the Persian Gulf somewhere? Where will that leave the Army? How quickly would it take the Army to turn to deal with that greater contingency, the greater than expected contingency? And knows that the current model of, lots of small conflicts in irregular kind of warfare focused turns out not to be right after 2014.
Here's Mara.
Well, I actually have a slightly different concern. I think the Army probably could handle that. Depending on its size, the issue would be a dwell time one. My bigger concern is that the department is heading down, and to some degree you see this reflected in the press, a line of argument that essentially says large-scale contingencies won't have a significant land component. Now, that's pretty ahistorical in my estimation, but that's the sort of conceptual trend that I see emerging. And so that is a much greater threat to me, to the Army, than them not being able to pivot if required. And I think fundamentally it means for the long term, if we were to get into a large-scale contingency where, again, my presumption is that there would be a significant land component, that we will take the efficiencies, we will realize savings on the backs of the Army, and then they definitely would not, then they would have trouble. So I think it's a longer-term problem.
My perspective on this actually is, I guess, quite a bit different. It took us 30 years to unlearn no more Vietnams. It may not be 30 years for no more Iraqs, but it's going to be quite a while. And I would argue that the Army has not switched to focus on irregular warfare anywhere near to the extent that some, Coinistas had called for. It was certainly a lot slower than many commanders wanted during that time. And I think they'll find it relatively easy to unlearn counterinsurgency and go back to a more comfortable focus on larger than expected conflicts. But I think it's going to be some time before this nation will support large commitments of land combat forces to conflicts. We'll find American ways to do it. The American way of war was quite the buzzword for a while after Desert Storm, which was precision fires and a whole series of things that we've actually until Kosovo.
For 4 or 5 years.
Right. Much improved capabilities even, in the world of Coinista during that time. So my sense of it is that the Army is not going to have that much trouble going back. And they're going to be happy not to be an occupying force anymore, which is where they're at right now.
I read the Army a little bit differently right now. I think they have, to some extent, embraced the idea that they do need to have a significant ability to spend long periods of time on the ground, and you see that in their new operational concept and other things. And my concern is the same as Clark's, that is not a politically sustainable line of argument, and that leaves them very vulnerable to reductions that I think are not in our long-term best interest. So we're not as far apart, I think, as it might have sounded initially.
Late breaking news, and then we'll do the last question. Second engine has come to a floor vote in the House. 198 to keep the engine in, 233 to take it out. I'm now a little less optimistic, Harlan, than I was before about the votes aren't there to cut defense. Last question over here on the right, and then we'll call it in. Yeah.
The extra engine.
Dave Patterson, National Defense Business Institute. Amidst all the pessimism, however, I was hoping to find a bit of an upside to all of this, but I couldn't. But I do have a practical question. Yesterday, Secretary Hale raised the issue of the turbulence and unpredictability and the problems that the CR was causing in the month-to-month contract negotiations and the premium that they were paying as a consequence. He also mentioned the fact that there were problems with the ceiling and no new starts, and that they were unable to execute at the planned rate. When you can't execute where you had planned, then your industry is in serious trouble. And what normally happens is you push that to the right. Now, it occurs to me that the 12 budget, as it was submitted, is not informed by that problem. What would be your advice to the industry who is now having to suffer through this? And I would see a time in the future where some poor program gets a Nunn-McCurdy breach because back in 2011 we had a CR that lasted this long.
You go
Okay.
first.
I think that, while I think that the Republican line on what the FY11 budget will be is probably going to be closer to realized, I expect there to be an appropriations bill that does it. Because the real problem that I think Hale is referring to is not the presence or absence of $10 billion more dollars, it's the lack of flexibility under a CR, which is no new starts and so on. So that, I think, the Department of Defense will get relief from, although Gates himself indicated, well, I can live with $540 billion, you know, which is $9 billion less than I wanted, and he'll end up with a bit less than that, but I think he's going to get the flexibility back. But that still doesn't address the long-term problem you're talking about, and that is that there's historically the department stops, and I think Maren is quite correct that it's made strides in the last 2 years in terms of more accurately projecting O&M costs. But historically, there's been a 2 to 3% per year growth in O&M that we never budget for. And that's always come out of procurement during that time. And so I think you're going to find a lot of procurement slips to the right.
There's two things that we're seeing. One, and I don't have any data on this, I only have anecdotes, and this comes from companies that tell me. Receivables are piling up. DOD is paying its bills more slowly, right? And I think a lot of companies are feeling that. Now, they don't actually pay the bills more slowly. What they do is they don't accept the invoices, right? And it's always easy to question a complex invoice. And so the clock doesn't start ticking on the Prompt Payment Act until you accept the invoice. And so they're technically not paying. They're just going slow in paying. And I hear this from companies large and small. But that reaches a static point where it really can't go much further than that. So I think we've probably already seen the worst of that, if you will. I actually think, Dave, there are a couple of points of optimism. Not only are we doing a better job of projecting real costs of operation and maintenance, but particularly since the passage of the Weapons System Acquisition Reform Act, which is just under 2 years ago, is a much more precise and realistic costing of weapon systems, both in the programs and in the budget years. And so that's great, because now we've got a much better idea of what it's really going to cost us, right? And you're making more realistic decisions and trade-offs as you do that. The problem is it starts to reduce some of your flexibility, because the way in which you take care of future funding issues that you didn't see is you park some money in budget areas where you can go borrow it when the time comes. And procurement was one of those areas. The more closely we have realistic costing and we have to actually execute to that costing, the less flexibility we have when it comes to play. I think that you're absolutely right. DOD put the FY12 budget together on the assumption that FY11 is the starting point. You look at the timelines. The services started putting that budget together this time last year. They didn't know we'd be in this mess today. They didn't predict the outcome of the November 2nd elections, or the size of the deficit that we would have, or the passage of the bills during the lame duck. And so I think Bob Hale is right, but he's right at a level of detail that's lost on the players, if you will. I also don't think, quite fundamentally, it affects the votes. I do believe we'll get an Appropriation Act, but not because DOD is in trouble executing, if you will. So we're going to probably, first of all, we want to thank you all for coming out here today.
Can I just make one last comment
please
on
do.
optimism? I just want to say, in my mind, if you are looking for optimism, the FY12 budget is it, and because it's going to get really ugly after that.
But I do think that the dynamics of the situation today and the uncertainty with respect to the FY11 appropriations, with respect to the government shutdown, with respect to what kind of role the defense budget plays in the ultimate debt reduction or debt ceiling deal that gets put into place, probably merits a revisit of this question at some point in time in advance of next February, when the FY13 budget is put together. And keep in mind, even though I said it'll be 2014 before we actually start seeing drawdowns, DOD starts putting together the 2014 budget 11 months from today. So it's not nearly as far off as it looks. So we'll probably be seeing you again, and hopefully we'll have much better news next time around. Thank you very much for attending.